Hi, my name's Phil Craig. I'm a writer, a TV producer, a lover of stories, and a connoisseur of scandal. And I'm on a mission to bring you the most scandalous tales ever told. So thanks for joining me here at the Scandal Mongers podcast. Welcome everybody to the Scandal Mongers podcast, and I am not alone. This chap over here.
Hello, good to see you. How are you doing today?
I am doing very well. Now, something about you is a little different, Mok. You've had a bit of a glow up, I think.
Well, I certainly have. I lost my hair between the age of 19 and 22, and I always felt that when I looked in the mirror, I never really saw the person reflected back in terms of my attitude and my confidence. So I turned 55 last year, and I thought, I no longer care what people think about me. I'm going to be a roaring old man, and went to London, paid some men and got some hair. It's not mine. It is real hair, but it's a man in Norway.
So I could say some men in London helped you.
Absolutely. Some men in London, which is very appropriate considering what we're about to talk about today.
It is. But first of all, I need to tell you, I also did something to my do last week at the beginning of the show. I did a slightly tongue-in-cheek, I could say, parody of Meghan Markle's cooking show. And if you'll indulge me, can I just read some of the comments?
Yeah, I'd love to, because I have watched the show, so I'll give you my thoughts as well.
Oh, dear. Oh, Phil, says J Parks 3623. That opening was so distasteful. It was beneath you. I've been a fan of this podcast since the beginning, but I'm going to have to move on. So there you are. We share everything here. We're open to all opinions. I didn't mean to be distasteful or offensive, but I guess it's a very politicized issue, isn't it? Anything to do with Meghan and Harry. And yeah, I don't know. Do you take a view on Meghan yourself?
So I actually asked some of my followers on my Instagram if they're going to watch, and it was interesting. The comments really split. About 54% said no. I thought it would be higher. I say, firstly, I don't know the woman. I don't know her. I think everyone has the right to be treated with dignity and respect and no discrimination, even if you are a nice person or not. Nobody is flawless. Let him without stone, sin, cast the first stone. I do. I've had some dealings with the sort of institution that she had to live in, and I can well believe that people didn't treat her very well, and she may have got very frustrated. And I think it's very easy to target a woman and a woman of color and destroy her. And I think whatever she does now, certainly some of the newspapers are out to get her. So I don't know the woman. I hope she's happy. I know people who know Harry and say he has changed. But again, I knew a bit about him when I lived very near the King in Highgrove. And honestly, I don't think he was happy then. If he's found some happiness now, good luck. We all get influenced by our partner. And I just hope that people leave them alone. It's hard, though, when they keep popping up. But what else are they supposed to do?
Well, look, that's very, very sort of even-handed and fair-minded and humane of you. Just exactly what I'd expect from you. And I feel really bad about putting on that wig. But it was only meant as a bit of teasing. And I think
there's nothing wrong with putting on a wig. There's nothing wrong with putting on a wig. I'll always support you. I don't call it a wig. I call it the ferret.
Actually, do you know, I'm not an expert on these things. Perhaps I will one day become an expert. But I think you look really, really good. There you are. I think it really suits you. And the tash as well just balances it nicely. Very good.
Captain Mannering.
So I'm going to do two more comments and then we'll get to the subject at hand. JL Dragon's Nest. I love your ramblings, Phil. Not everybody does. I don't always agree with what you say, but it's always thought-provoking and makes me think. Now, that's what we were just saying, There's not many spaces out here on the internet where you can actually get two sides of issues. I really believe that. We're living in a very politicized... It's like a football team, You support Man United or Arsenal, the Boston Red Sox or the New York Yankees or whatever it is, or you support Meghan or you support Kate. And the other side, they're only wrong, they're evil. And I don't like that.
I have to say I love Kate, but I don't think Meghan's evil.
Well, I think that's absolutely
Catherine.
Right.
Nobody I know who knows her ever calls her Kate. She is Catherine. It's only the papers and media people that call her.
I get into trouble for calling her Kate. Sorry, Catherine. Final comment, just because I love showing off, and not everybody hates the podcast. Thank you so much, Phil, for making Ruth Ellis back into a person rather than just the statistic of the last woman executed. Thank you, Chris H2277. Now, that was actually the meat of the last episode, was this brilliant interview with Carol Ann Lee, who is such a fantastic writer. I don't know if you ever looked at her book on Ruth Ellis, but you really should. It's a terrific read.
Well, I know we've been talking about the fact my mother knew Ruth Ellis. We've been messaging back and forth, so I was particularly interested in that episode. My mother and my father used to love greyhound racing. I come from an Irish farming family, and greyhounds are in our blood. And Ruth used to go with her boyfriends, plural, my mother said, to the racetrack. My mother knew her, and she was a little bit brash, she said. My mother sometimes described her once as a little bit tarty, but they were friends. And my mother actually went to the hanging, and I remember, obviously I didn't know anything about Ruth, as she died years before I was born, and my mother talked about how people in the streets all around the prison got on one knee and you could just hear people praying. And sometimes my mother would put my brother and I down at night, we'd say our prayers, and sometimes we'd pray for her friend Ruth. And it was only last week when we were messaging that I realized her friend Ruth must have been Ruth Ellis. So
how extraordinary.
very impactful. And I'm glad that her story, my mother always felt that she was really badly treated by society because of who she was and her background. And so I wish my mother is here or would be here to see the real understanding of her story.
That's an interesting comment, because the role of faith in this story was so interesting, because it was almost as if she really believed, even though she'd killed Derek, the partner, the abusive partner, even though she'd killed him, she was still in love with him, and she believed that she could be with him in heaven, in another place. And that's why she didn't in any way encourage the campaign to save her. And she might actually have been saved, with maybe a little bit more weight, because there were so many extenuating circumstances, like the fact that he'd beaten her into a miscarriage. I mean,
but again, remember, reference to Meghan as well. Women very rarely win. Any woman who sins in the eyes of society must be punished, whether it's in the Daily Mail or whether it's in a prison.
Interesting. Well, we're talking about the darker side of the 40s and 50s. And I guess that's a really nice way to go into the subject of this episode, which you've chosen. So why don't you tell us what we're doing?
Yes, so we've met the amazing writer, Peter Parker, not Spider-Man, who has 2 volumes called Some Men in London, looking at London, the life of gay men in London in the 50s and the 60s, the scandals in the newspaper, the relationships they had, the attitude of the legal profession and society in general, and basically looks into the lived experiences of men in London who were having sex with men. And I think it's really interesting because a lot of people, when they talk about gay history, really start it at 1969 with the Stonewall riots at the famous Stonewall Inn in New York, but forget that there's a whole history of activism and secrecy and scandal way before that. And in Britain, the history of gay people is often told as American history. We have our own British history too.
Excellent. Well, that's set it up perfectly. Let's go and talk to him, and see you soon.
See you soon.
See you. I doff my hair to you. Bye. Peter, welcome to our little scandalous world.
Thank you for having me on. I feel I'll fit in very nicely.
Well, you're amongst the first people to see Mok's new hairdo.
Indeed, yes.
Yes, look, dreams can come true. Yeah. At 55, you can in greed. Yeah. Meet some men in London and grow some hair.
Grow some hair, yes. I thought you put hair on your chest, not on your head, reading my book.
Well, your book, I mean, it's
wherever I want to be.
Your book, I should say books, Peter, a real labour of love. Yeah. I mean, it took you the best part of a decade, didn't it, to assemble all this material?
Well, not quite 6 years, sort of from start to finish. But, that also included lockdown. So where all the libraries and the archives closed. So, but I still had, well, as you can see behind me, plenty of books to be reading. This is just part of my Some Men in London library. There's a whole other bit over there as well. So floor to ceiling over there of the various books that I've used in one way or another.
And what made you want to take on this enormous task?
Well, I was actually asked by Penguin to do it. They approached me. I mean, I'd like to say it was my idea, but in fact, they approached me, and I think because they knew I'd written biographies of Christopher Ishwood and J.R. Ackley, I'd started my career reviewing books for Gay News, the old Gay News, when it was in a newspaper format. And I had a sort of, my first book about the First World War, there was quite a lot of gaiety in that. And then I did a book on Houseman as well. So I sort of knew the territory. So I think they thought I was the sort of the right person. So they approached me, and we sort of hit it off immediately and came to much the same conclusions about how to put the book together.
I write a lot about I'm sorry, Mok, do go ahead.
I was going to ask about because we are talking scandal, and you talk about moral panic after the Second World War. And I was just, how much do you think that moral panic and the newspapers reporting of scandalous homosexual activities impacted on discrimination and oppression of homosexuals?
Oh, enormously, I think. Though I think sort of before this period, I know when I was doing research, by the very crude method of going to the British Newspaper Archive online and typing the word homosexual and the dates 1945 to 67. Well, of course, a lot came up that wasn't London, but also often newspapers, particularly in the earlier period, wouldn't refer to homosexuality. They say a serious offence, or serious offences took place. So, but it's undoubtedly true that the more it was discussed in public, the more scandalized people were. And this was against the backdrop of increased arrests and indeed increased or a perceived increase rise in homosexual crime, which probably meant that it was being detected more quickly and easily and dealt with. But after the Second World War, there was this moral panic, and it was not only homosexuality that was seen on the rise, but also prostitution. The divorce rate went skyrocketing up, illegitimacy, and juvenile delinquency. So homosexuality was just one of them. But if you're looking for a scapegoat, historically, homosexuality is the one to go for.
Yeah.
And of course, homosexuality is mixed in with ideas of masculinity. I mean, traditionally, the notion of the homosexual as this sort of Nancy, effete person. We don't know anybody like that, of course, but this idea of the cliched gay man who was rejecting masculinity. And also we were losing the empire, and the empire was also bound up with masculinity as well. So it was a threat to masculinity as well as to morals. So I think that's why it was particularly, and also it was thought to be like measles, it was catching. So we had to protect particularly the youth of the country who might be led astray by older men. But it was this idea that, once you'd had a homosexual experience, that was it. You were likely to be infected for life with this fatal, or perhaps not fatal, but chronic disease.
It's interesting. Especially in your first volume, there's an awful lot about class as well. The idea that it's the sort of wealthier, maybe more sophisticated older men, perhaps in the theatre or the clergy, or I don't know, perhaps they're politicians. And they're going out and they're corrupting these young, good-looking working-class boys who, had they not run into this older, wealthier man, they would never have had any interest in this sort of thing.
Yes, this is one of the myths that I particularly wanted to explode, because it was sort of put about, particularly in the tabloids, and I regret to say by the Labour Party in Parliament, that, working class people were fine, upstanding heterosexual citizens, and they couldn't possibly be homosexual unless they'd been got at by someone who's their social or financial superior. And in fact, one of the things I did was look at court records in London, and some of the ones for the magistrates' courts, particularly Lambeth and others, they not only give the names and the ages of those who are accused, but also their jobs. So you get quite as many labourers, waiters, plasterers, just general working class people. They make as many appearances, in fact, more than the usual sort of roll call of schoolmasters, actors, the sort of the clergymen, the usual suspects. So in fact, the sort of middle class suspects. So in fact, of course, and now it seems absurd that anybody ever thought it, but homosexuality was, as they would put it, rife as much amongst the working classes as it was amongst the upper and middle classes. But it was sort of perceived as some sort of decadent upper class vice. I mean, even to the point we're saying that these people have too much time on their hands. They've tried heterosexuality and they're bored with it. So they just go out and become homosexual, which psychologically doesn't seem to me to be a very likely prospect.
The start of, again, this is maybe more about the earlier volume, but it's quite sad. I mean, there's a very, you show a side of England that we don't normally think of. We think of the 40s and the 50s, quite a heroic period. It's often mythologized. And actually, you see the brutality and the stupidity, the sort of very, very kind of dark stories of people being punished so viciously. I mean, we all know about Alan Turing, but there are hundreds and hundreds of stories almost at that level that you unearth. It's terribly sad.
Of course. Yes, I mean, there are the famous cases that get attention, like, as you say, Alan Turing, or in acting, John Gielgud, or indeed John Cranko, the choreographer. And his arrest only made small, tiny, no one had really heard of him, but it made little tiny news items. But that was picked up by John Dean Potter. This was in 1959. And became this enormous case because he wrote a whole article based on this one arrest to say the theatre is full of corrupting older men, and they make young actors sleep with them in order to get them jobs. And then John Osborne wrote a rebuttal of this, though being John Osborne, it wasn't a totally sort of wholehearted rebuttal. I mean, John Osborne's relationship with homosexuality one could have a whole program about how complicated that was. And I think it was Oscar Wilde who said, "Now, come on, John, just how homosexual are you?" And I think he said 20%, which is quite high. But this became one of the sort of big headlines of the news, was the theatre world being corrupted, because we'd already had the John Gielgud scandal in 1953. And Binky Beaumont, who was the theatrical impresario, it was said, that he was in a homosexual cabal. But in fact, most of the people he employed were heterosexual and women. So it was a myth. Of course, there were gay people in the theatre. There always have been. But this sort of, it was just it was a typical idea of the tabloids, picking on some minor offence and blowing it up into a major scandal.
Talking of the tabloids, I was interested in the 1963 article in the Sunday Mirror, How to Spot a Homo. Some of our listeners, certainly our younger listeners, may not have heard of that classic article. Do you want to talk a little bit about the article, and actually, interestingly, how it and why it came about, because that links into kind of Russian and spies and a whole other history.
Indeed, yes. Well, this is really the John Vassal case. John Vassal was an Admiralty clerk who had been sent off to Moscow, and there had been he was gay, and the Soviets did a sort of honey trap and photographed him having sex with a man. I mean, there is some debate as to how far they merely suggested, or how far he was coerced and bullied into this. And then they started getting him to spy in order to be not exposed. And it was a sort of major case. This was in 1962, and he was convicted and imprisoned for spying. But at the same time, there was a very unfortunate, the civil lord of the Admiralty, Thomas Galbraith, who was Vassal's boss, and it had been suggested that he was shielding Vassal because they were in some sort of relationship. And poor old Galbraith, who was married with lots of children, was sort of held up as this sort of, no one quite said it, but it was suggested. In fact, he was entirely innocent, and Vassal later said, there was no relationship between them. They were friendly. I think he probably rather hero-worshipped Galbraith. But anyway, after the case was over, it was decided there should be a tribunal, a government inquiry as to how it come this person. No one had spotted that he was gay and therefore a security threat. And while this was going on, tabloid journalists gained access to his flat. So there's quite a lot about, this man, how could they have not known? Because, he had teddy bears on his bed and far too many perfumes in the bathroom. And so there was this sort of rather ridiculous idea going on. But it was an idea that somehow the Admiralty should have spotted it. And the findings of the tribunal was that even though he was rumoured to be called Auntie by some of the other clerks, no one would have really known that he was gay. I mean, I think it was a bit of a whitewash. Anyway, because they said no one could possibly have known, a terrifying journalist called Lionel Crane, who wrote in the Sunday Mirror, did produce this notorious article, How to Spot a Possible Homo, which sort of started by saying, well, if the Admiralty and the inquiry don't know what to look for, we do. But the list of different types of homosexual ranged from the sort of classic pansy type to someone who wore a tweed jacket and smoked a pipe that stood rather too close to you in a bar. So it was this, they had it every way. So it wasn't actually a terribly helpful article if people were really wanting to spot a possible homo.
But I think it's stuck in the psyche, though. It's stuck in the public psyche. I remember my father quoting it to me when I came out, and that was 20 odd years later. It was still in the psyche.
I think it is one of the most notorious. There was the earlier one, which I think was in the 40s, which was These Evil Men, which was a sort of 4-part expose of homosexual life. And these are sort of things that really, had an enormous impact. There is somewhere, and it's in a gay memoir somewhere, of some gay man holding up how he's being photographed holding up the article How to Spot a Possible Homo and grinning widely. So I think a lot of gay men must have also found it funny because it was such a ridiculous article. But of course, there was a serious point that it was about that gay men were not only, hanging around in bars and picking up people in urinals and making a general nuisance of themselves, but they were also betraying their country, because we'd already had in 1951 the missing diplomats, as Burgess and Maclean were called, because they disappeared, both employed in the Foreign Office, and just vanished overnight. And Burgess was a notorious homosexual and drunk, and so indiscreet. It's astonishing anyone ever employed him at all, let alone in somewhere where he had access to secrets. And it was thought that Maclean was possibly bisexual. The jury's still out on that. Again, drink was his real undoing. But there was some speculation that the two of them had sort of eloped to the continent to live together. And Burgess later said rather ungallantly, not at all. It would have been like sleeping with a great white woman. Just not very generous of him. But anyway, they in 1956, they turned up and gave a press conference in Moscow, because, of course, what they'd done was they'd fled to their Soviet masters. And so there was a lot in the press about, gay men are a terrible security risk, and because they're open to blackmail. Though, of course, actually, in the same way that it wasn't illegal, but socially unacceptable, a heterosexual who was an adulterer could be open to blackmail. So, but of course, if you were homosexual, you were liable to be, banged up in prison. So it was slightly more, a much more serious thing. But in terms of blackmail, it didn't really hold water. And in fact, we all know that from later history that, all these organizations like Foreign Office, there were always gay people in them. And, most of them were not a security risk and behaved impeccably. But of course, the press is always looking for a scapegoat. And so Vassal, it was very much, this is Burgess and Maclean all over again. Though the circumstances were entirely different.
There are some amazing life stories in your work. George Lucas pops up a lot because he documented his own life in such detail. And I don't know how typical this was of the gay experience of those decades, but it's an incredible mixture of kind of joy and thrill and fear that he lived, the way he lived his life.
Yeah.
But you also wonder whether had it been legal, he would have lived any different way. Maybe he was addicted to some aspect of the danger, and maybe that's a straight perspective on gay life that you can knock down.
No. I think that's absolutely right. In fact, I mean, I was extremely lucky because George Lucas left his diaries to a journalist called Hugo Greenhalgh, and Hugo produced his own book, which had extracts from the diaries with a sort of memoir of George Lucas last year. But he very generously allowed me to read the diaries. I mean, fortunately, I was particularly interested in the 40s and 50s, and he was more interested for his book in the 1960s. But one of the things that I would have really liked to have put in right at the end, but Hugo wanted to use it in his book, so I didn't, is where when homosexuality is partially decriminalized, he writes a wonderful entry in his diary about saying, it's like being locked out of an orchard, and finally the gates are flung open, and all that beautiful fruit you saw hanging in the garden, you pick it and you eat it, and it's actually bitter on the tongue and it's acrid. And I think he wasn't alone in that. I had a friend who used to refer to some of his older friends as the pre-Wolfendens. These were people who rather regretted that partial legalization had come in, because a lot of it's to do with the thrill. And also, I think there is a sort of, some people like being outsiders and being, going against the grain. And I think a lot of gay men, they had to be outsiders, and they had to be going against the majority for all their lives, or most of their lives. But I think there is certainly quite a few who sort of, the thrill was slightly diminished by the fact it was partially legalized. But of course, for most gay men, it was an enormous relief that they weren't going to be arrested, though of course they could still be arrested for all sorts of crimes that weren't committed in private. I mean, crimes in inverted commas, because it was only legalized for men in private, consenting adults over the age of 21 in private. And also so that excluded things like hotel bedrooms, apparently, even. But also it only applied in England and Wales, so not in Scotland or Northern Ireland. And it didn't apply in any armed forces or the merchant navy. So that didn't happen until so much later. We forget that, legalization didn't arrive in Scotland and Northern Ireland until the 1980s. And homosexuality remained a reason for dismissal from the forces up until, I think, about 2012, or perhaps even later. I haven't got the statistics.
I had no idea. Isn't it incredible?
No, I think we sort of say, oh yes, 1967, everything was all right. But in fact, because things like soliciting, because it wasn't in private, so picking up men for sex was still illegal. In fact, in London, the figures went up after decriminalisation, or partial decriminalisation. So the police were very, very keen to Sir Joseph Simpson, who was the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police at the time, was very, very stern about it all. And he had wanted to continue using plainclothes policemen who would go into lavatories and sort of stand there and wait. And if someone approached them, they would then arrest them. I mean, they always claim they never used agent provocateur, but I mean, they sort of did, really. And Roy Jenkins, who was the Labour Home Secretary around the time of partial decriminalisation, had tried to persuade Sir Joseph Simpson that he should use uniformed policemen, because if they stood outside lavatories, men wouldn't go in, because they think, well, the police are here, well, I'm not going to risk it. So he was all for deterrence. And then Sir Joseph Simpson said that he would, he was very much against, he reluctantly agreed, but within weeks of partial decriminalisation, he was saying, I'm putting plainclothes policemen back on the beat in order to deal with those crimes that were still on the statute book. And I was just trying to find in my notes what he said about when he was police commissioner. So this was up and through beyond 1967. An astounding 2,758 man days a year, which was the equivalent of the full-time service of 9 police constables, were spent in London on observation to detect and deal with importunity. So this fantastic waste of police resources he defended. He thought it wasn't at all unreasonable. But obviously Roy Jenkins thought rather differently, quite rightly.
I mean, you talked about kind of about it, not being able to be named, and there was kind of alluding to it in the newspapers. The Worthington Committee, which, recommended the partial discrimination, decriminalisation of homosexuality, they couldn't even use the term either. I think it's rather interesting how they chose to refer to homosexuals and prostitutes. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because it's quite funny, but also quite tragic.
Yeah, it is, yes. Well, it was very odd because Sir John Wolfenden, who was appointed by the government, it was partly in the wake of the Lord Montague of Bewley scandal, where Lord Montague, a landowner called Michael Pitt Rivers, and the journalist Peter Wildebroad were arrested. And Montague had already been arrested for offences with Boy Scouts. And I have to be very careful here because these are not little boys. These are, hulking great teenage Boy Scouts who complained that he'd had relations with them. And he went on trial, and during the trial, it became quite clear that the police had doctored evidence. For example, they'd altered a date on his passport, or someone had. And I mean, the police had the passport, so the conclusion was. So this was thought, very bad, reflect very badly on the policing of this so-called crime. But the jury was dismissed, and the case was sort of put on one side. So the police went round and trawled around to find someone else who would testify against Montague, and found these two airmen who turned Queen's evidence. One was, in fact, a former boyfriend of Peter Wildeblood. And when they were arrested, Peter Wildeblood in his London home, the police burst in. They searched his house without a police warrant, and they didn't allow him access to solicitors. So the police were actually behaving illegally themselves. And so this did raise questions about the way the law was administered. So the government decided to appoint Sir John Wolfenden. He was later Lord Wolfenden, but at this point it was Sir John Wolfenden, who was an educationalist. He was at Reading University, the Chancellor of Reading University, but he'd also been the headmaster of 2 public schools. And he took charge of this inquiry into homosexuality and prostitution. And what you're referring to is that because there were sort of lady stenographers involved, they didn't want to use such shocking words. So they were Huntley and Palmer, after the biscuit manufacturers, H. homosexual Huntleys and P. Palmers. And I mean, Sir John was fairly naive, because when he was interviewed, when he was first appointed to chair this commission, said, well, in many ways, it'll be a distasteful operation, but in a queer sort of way, I'm looking forward to it, which shows a certain naivety. And there was a further complication that he had a son who was gay, Jeremy Wolfenden, a very mysterious character. And Jeremy Wolfenden claimed that when his father was appointed to head the inquiry into homosexuality and prostitution, he wrote him a letter saying, I feel we should stay out of each other's way for the time being, and will you please wear less eye makeup? I suspect that Jeremy made that because I don't think Sir John had quite that sense of humour. But anyway, so they sat for ages and took witnesses from all over the place. I mean, one of the pieces I like most in my book, if one could say one likes a bit more than any other, is the interviews they did with 2 policemen on the sort of vice squad in the West End, and one in the West End and one in Chelsea. One called PC Butcher, which somehow seems right. And in fact, what occasionally they asked for people to write submissions, but in other cases they interviewed people and the stenographer would take down. So we actually get these police voices completely unmediated. So it's just what they said. And I have to say, I think they come out of it rather well. I mean, they're administering a law, but they sort of see the funny side of it. And they're not sort of horrified. I think they're really mystified by why anyone would want to go to a public lavatory to pick someone up. But I think they come out of it quite well. Unlike most of the police, I have to say the police come out of this book very badly, though perhaps not as badly as the psychiatric community, who completely just put forward crackpot theories about the causes of homosexuality, and were basically people who thought it should be somehow eradicated, that it was an unfortunate. I mean, when we have this move towards decriminalisation, it was the idea that these people aren't criminals, but they are probably mentally unstable. So it wasn't really a move in the right direction, though in fact it did work. But the psychiatric community came out of it very badly, I think.
Gosh. Mok, I'd love to know what you feel reading this probably unprecedented kind of chronicling of the community. How does it make you feel?
So I really welcomed them because I talk a lot about LGBTQ plus history on the socials, and a lot of people think that sort of gay history started in the Stonewall riots in 1969, if they even know that at all, and know that, the prides that we have now, which are these kind of marvelous community celebrations, started in a riot, started in resistance, started actually with a lot of support from the trans community. That's a year that I was born in. But actually, our history, of course it does. Queers have been here for years. It goes back so far. So for me, I really welcome the fact that this has been chronicled, because so much of this history is disappearing because these individuals, it's remained oral history or in archives. Their stories are being lost. And I think it's really important and wonderful that Peter has chronicled it. And I've got it in downstairs loo in the castle, and it's very much there as kind of reading material for people. I find it slightly ironic that it's in a loo, but it's very much there, that kind of says we're here, yes, and my history is important.
Yeah. Well, I think it is true that particularly the sort of 40s and 50s are a forgotten era. There are memoirs, you're right, and there are some very good memoirs, but I wanted to give the by not using anything that was published outside my 2 dates or written outside the 2 dates between. So everything in the book was either written, broadcast, published between 45 and 67. So there's no retrospective. And I wanted to give that sort of texture of what it was really like to live through that era. And someone, when I was doing a talk, came up afterwards, and I suppose he was in his probably mid-30s, so not very young. But he said, I had absolutely no idea there were gay bars and pubs in the 40s and 50s. I think we have this idea that all this happened sort of post-Stonewall, as you say. He actually said, and I didn't realize gay men had so much fun and so much sex. And it's slightly like, we used to look back to the Victorians and think, they were all sort of prim and proper. But of course, they were all at it like rabbits in every combination you could possibly imagine. And I did want to have, as well as the terrible stories of blackmails and suicides and arrests and persecution, I did want to have that sense that actually a lot of people were having a lot of fun as well. And that sort of resilience, and particularly the use of humor, I think is very characteristic of the struggle. I mean, I think we're now in an era where laughter has rather disappeared because the arguments about, for example, trans rights have become so vitriolic and so narrow and difficult. And, when you sort of go back to this period, it was debated in full, and nobody was saying, you can't say that. You could say anything. And it has to be said that much what was said is absolutely abhorrent to us today, and quite rightly. So I think it's an era that it fascinates me. And as Mok said, I think there are very few people who appear in this book who are still alive. These are generations that are now, if not going, they're gone. And one of my earlier books was about the last veterans of the First World War, and I feel it's sort of rather the same, that I was dealing with people who were on the edge of vanishing from history, and who should be remembered in both cases. And I think particularly some of the people who formed people who worked with Wolfenden and people who formed the Homosexual Law Reform Society, because when the Wolfenden report was published in 1957, it took 10 years for Parliament even to debate the subject. And so the Homosexual Law Reform Society was founded in order to lobby Parliament to at least talk about it. And their real aim was to get them to act on the recommendations that, with certain provisos, homosexuality should be decriminalised. And people like A.E. Dyson, who founded the Homosexual Law Reform Society with a man called Reverend Halliday Smith, who was a young married clergyman, who so disappeared from the record that when I was doing a talk, I could find no image of him anywhere on the internet. And these are people whose names mean nothing today to people, and we need to remember that the rights we enjoy didn't just arrive by magic. There were brave people who stood up to be counted, and it's very good to find. I'm very happy to tell their stories, to just remind everyone that what it was like and what people fought for and what they fought against.
Do you think you're finished now, or are you going to continue into the 70s?
This is the question I'm asked at every talk I give. And the answer is I'm not going to continue it in the same sense. This is partly because shortly after we end, in the early 70s, I came to London as a student. And I went on those marches and did those protests and wrote for Gay News and like that. So for me, it's not really history any longer. It's just too close. I suspect temperamentally, I'm more interested in, not that I think it's a good thing, but I'm sort of interested in secrecy and oppression more than liberation. I find it as a topic to write about, it's more interesting. And if I did anything, I'd possibly go backwards. But also there's another whole story to be told about life outside London as well, because a lot of very major cases, including, in fact, the Montague case, which was tried at the Hampshire Assizes, a lot of these cases and a lot of life was going on outside the capital. But I'm not, at the moment, I'm sort of thinking this will certainly do. 2 volumes is more than enough. They're quite stout volumes as it is.
Do you think a straight writer, a male or a female heterosexual writer, can write gay lives, or should it not matter?
Yeah, I don't think it should matter. It sometimes does. I mean, I think we've all read utterly dud biographies of gay people by heterosexuals who simply didn't get it. But on the other hand, one of the earliest sort of warts and all biography was Michael Holroyd's enormous biography of Lytton Strachey, which is a sort of masterpiece. And Michael is heterosexual, and but he got it. And so I don't think one can be prescriptive about it. I think there are cases where things that, if you are gay, things will strike you while you're doing research that might not strike you if it wasn't part of your experience. But that's probably a bonus and an add-on. I mean, I can't imagine any heterosexual particularly wanting to wade through the number of cases of people in urinals that I've had to do while researching this. And I think there is, but there's no reason somebody shouldn't. I mean, someone also asked, what about a volume about women? And of course, the reason the women aren't in is because it tells the story of decriminalisation, and lesbianism was never criminalised, though a Glasgow MP did have a go at criminalising it in about, I think, 1926. And the Commons were quite keen on the idea, but the Lords threw it out. The Lords come out of this book in some way. Individual members of the Lords come out of it pretty badly. But when homosexuality was partially decriminalised, Lord Arran, who piloted the bill through the House of Lords, reminded the peers that it was this House, he said, that led the way on this matter. So there is I sort of feel that as far as going, yes, women. If there was a book about lesbians, I think that probably should be written by a woman. But of course, it'd be a very different story. It's not that lesbians weren't treated quite as badly, but they weren't actually liable to arrest because it wasn't illegal. So there you are. Any lesbians listening, if you want to follow in my footsteps and do the lives of lesbians during this period, I'd be certainly interested in reading it.
Mok, I mean, you must have. I know you recommend these books a lot on your own rather popular Instagram account. So it's clearly something that's touched you quite personally, I think.
Yeah, I think also what I love about it is that so often the story of the gay history seems very doom-filled, and it is about the struggle. And what I like about about these volumes is that, you know, there's color and humor. And, you know, a lot of time people who they are oppressed, they use humor to sort of give them energy to move forward. And I think certainly some of the catty comments and the letters that you've drawn upon there, whilst you're talking about things that are very tragic and difficult to have gone through, I found myself laughing and I found myself really enjoying it. One thing I would say, I lent this to a young homosexual. I lent it to a guy in his 20s, and he came back to me and said, "Oh, I didn't like the language. I thought it was really offensive." And we had a very interesting conversation about whether or not terms that were used then should be used to, you know, how historically accurate you should be. And I feel very strongly, actually, you use the language of the time. He was incredibly offended by you, Peter. What are your thoughts on the fact that this young man was offended by you?
Oh, I think young people these days are very easily offended, is what I would say, first of all. But I say in the introduction of Volume 1 that, you know, you ought to be offended by this book because a lot of what's in it is upsetting and seems appalling, and the language used is appalling. But I don't think we should whitewash history, and, you know, not least because particularly even since the book's been published, what's going on in the world is we don't want to step back, you know, into this world of oppression and rights being removed. You know, rights are not easily won and they can just disappear. So I think it's that young people should know what was going on. I mean, some of the older men have objected to my use of the word queer, but again, as I say in the introduction, I'm not using it in the way it's now used as sort of for any sexual difference or any sort of sexual, you know, yes, difference, I suppose. But I'm using it because that was the way people were usually referred to. And also gay men often called each other queer, and in a very sort of casual, friendly way, you know, rather like the N word, which can be used by black people, but not really by white people. But when I've explained to people why I use the word queer, they have sort of understood that it's not, you know, it isn't a sneer. It's actually just a sort of accurate reflection of the times.
One thing, this chap, he's in the army, and he was quite shocked at the history of homosexuality in the Guards. He was like, I had no idea.
No, I think a lot of people in the army don't. And the army always sort of tried to deny it while it was going on. And they were horrified when cases came to court. And it's quite interesting that, I mean, someone said, shouldn't I do a talk at the Guards Museum? But I thought perhaps it wouldn't be entirely welcome. But it is a very long history. It goes right back to at least the early 19th century that guardsmen moonlighted as male prostitutes. And there are all sorts of cases. I quote Simon Raven's marvellous article about the male prostitute in London. And one of the people he's talking about is a guardsman. And he says, you know, you join up as a young guardsman in London, and, you know, the older men will say, now, these are the places you need to go. If you want to make a bit of money, just go around, hang around Hyde Park, and Mr. Lucas may come trotting along, waving some cash at you. And so the army was in this sort of bind that it was actually a sort of tradition within the, and, you know, the army is very keen on tradition, but it's one tradition they don't really like talking about. And one of the things I discovered when I was researching the National Archives is that there was a file I found that said homosexual offences in the armed forces. So I thought, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah. And I found that all the names and ranks and details had been redacted for the soldiers, but not for the hapless civilians who were named alongside them. So, which seems a bit tough on the civilians. You know, I think you should have it. You couldn't have it both ways.
I feel sure I read about Tom Dryburgh once, and he was at Buckingham Palace or watching the Guards parade around. He said, "I'm sure I've had sex with at least half of those men, probably in Hyde Park."
Well, yes, there's a very fun.
Sorry.
Yes, James. Anywhere close to barracks. There's a nice piece I found in Chips Channon's diaries where he is having a regular meetings with the guardsmen who I think it's the King of Norway is making a state visit, and he's watching from a balcony, and there goes the carriage with the Queen in, and also one of the outriders is his guardsman. he says, I waved at both. The Queen waved back, the Guardsman didn't, which I thought was a very charming idea. And of course, that extraordinary juxtaposition of which you get a lot of in Channing's diaries of high-ranking people and the male prostitutes. But of course, a lot of those they were like other prostitutes. They weren't necessarily homosexual. I mean, George Lucas seemed to find quite a few who, seemed to actually enjoy it. But I think a lot of them were doing it just to earn money. So the reason, I suppose, that the names are redacted is that quite a few of them could still be, happy grandfathers with strings of children and grandchildren who wouldn't welcome their murky past, about which they probably never talked, being brought up.
What's Mok mentioned the humour and the funny story. What's your favourite funny story from all of the books?
Goodness, that's really tricky.
Oh, well, you don't have to answer if you don't want.
This is one that I think it's a fascinating story, but it has a humorous element. It's not entirely humorous, but for those in the know, it's actually Lord Arran who piloted the bill to decriminalise homosexuality through the Lords. It's his older brother who died a long time ago, so he got the title. And I had no idea. I just found a newspaper item about Viscount Suderley, which is what he was before, because his father was still alive. And so to me, it was just a story about some old aristo who had invited some chaps to do some wrestling back in his flat in London. Or you can imagine what sort of wrestling it might have involved. And of course, these people cased the joint and then came back and burgled it. And the judge was sort of so serious about, you were sort of slightly asking for it. But it was fascinating that this was someone whose brother then piloted the bill to decriminalise homosexuality through the Lords. But I think that's very funny. There's a very funny story in the one of the policemen I mentioned in the Wolfenden report, who said, the trouble is that, once you pick them up, even if you want to, it's hard to get rid of them. And he was picked. He said he was in a lavatory. He went out of the lavatory. He was followed by this man, and he just went off because he was actually going off duty. And this man kept following and following and following, and he didn't really know what to do. And anyway, he then arrived at his police station, and the man was still there and said, "Are you arresting me? I was following you back to your place." And the police said, "Well, in a way, this is my place." And he thought it was very funny. I mean, he tells it rather affectionately. But I did want to get in some of these, some of the humour, and of course I put in Julian and Sandy and Polari from Round the Horn and things like that. And I think it's a necessary balance between. I don't think having funny stories in any way diminishes or dilutes the horror of a lot of what happened. But I think if it was all suicide and blackmail, it would be a very grim read indeed.
Well, it's anything but, and I am so grateful to you for sparing all this time. I said half an hour. We're getting towards 50 minutes. I'm sorry, but
that's all right. It's a free afternoon.
Oh, that's good. No, but thank you so much. What is the next project? Is there a next project?
Well, there isn't. I'm actually probably going to do something entirely different. I'm hoping to go and curate an art exhibition, which is something I've never done. And it's an exhibition of the work of Humphrey Spender, who was the poet Stephen Spender's younger brother, and he was a painter and a photographer. And we're hoping to mount an exhibition. I knew him well in his later life and have had an interest in his work. He's best known as a photographer because he was the only photographer for mass observation in the 1930s, but he was a lifelong painter as well, and he did designs for ocean liners and shops and things. So it's a fascinating life. Actually bisexual with 3 wives and many boyfriends, but we're hoping that this will come off. So fingers crossed. Okay,
Mok, I think we're going to have to go and see that.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We'll be there. We'll be there with a small non-alcoholic drink in hand, chatting away. Marvelous.
I will keep informed.
Mine will definitely be alcoholic. Very good to talk to you, Peter.
And to you. Okay.
See you soon, I hope. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Well, hello. I'm sorry that Mok can't be with me at the end of the show because I have travelled. He's busy. And I did say last week I'd show you where I am. So since I recorded that interview with Mok and Peter, I've moved here. Can you see those mountains? That's the Dolomites. It's the Austrian-Italian border. We're just in Italy here, though most people speak German, in the lovely town of Tolbach, or Dobbiaco if you're Italian, Tolbach if you're not. Well, I think they're all Italians, but they speak different languages. Anyway, there you go. You get a geography lesson as well as an interesting scandalous documentary podcast. Thank you for joining me. And yes, I'll be back home in time for the next podcast. Not sure what it will be. It might be Catherine the Great. It will be Catherine the Great, actually. But lots of things bubbling. Anyway, for the next few days, I shall be up in those mountains with Mrs. Craig, trying not to get lost in a snowstorm, or more likely fall into a pile of snow and have to be ignominiously carried down the mountain. It's happened before, but no, we're going to have great fun. And thank you once again for joining me. Please like and subscribe. I think this was a really interesting episode. It's great to have Mok. I'm going to have Mok on quite a lot more, I think. I think it's really nice doing things with him. But for the moment, thank you, goodbye, and see you soon. This has been a Podcast World production. If you want to contact me, write to team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or you can reach out via the social media links in the show's bio. And if you've enjoyed this episode and you want to support the show, please consider taking a few seconds to hit the donate button found just below this video. Many thanks, and see you next week.